In comes a new year, so what better time to start than that one project you've been time and again for one reason or another pushing back. Where to even begin though? Well, it does feel like we are on the same boat in this one. Now we just need a third friend and a dog to make a classic. Nevertheless, lucky for us, we don't have to figure everything out on our own. There's plenty of giants whose shoulders we can stand on. You wanna learn sewing? Done! Outdoor survival? There's an entire book series on that. Roman history? I actually recommend you listen to Mike Duncan's The History of Rome in this one. If you are interested, there are certain themes that you are in fact better off exploring through other formats, or otherwise I'm saying you might be better off listening to an expert rather than going in blind. If you wanted my advice on that end though, Peter Heather has written a couple of books on the matter, so has Mike Duncan, but Heather's books are a bit more accessible. How about a book on writing though? Now that's a bit more complicated. Not only are there a bunch of them, they all deal with different issues, and they are each obviously useful in their own right, since someone had to write them in the first place. Now, I'm not saying I'm particularly qualified to say which ones are best. I've had 4 things that I've written published. 3 of them are articles in an anime magazine, and one of them was my thesis, which it is a lot easier to convince someone to publish something you've written if you don't ask for any compensation. So yeah, I get why my dissertation about why Lucha Libre is in fact an art form and a sport isn't going to impress anyone, but humor me as I present to you my top 10 books about writing. Number 10 is Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke. I'ma be honest, this is what got me to do this list in the first place. I had just finished this book and it got me thinking, basically, this is literally what it says on the can. Young blood sent a couple of letters to OG Austrian poet Rainer Maria Rilke, asking him, "Am I good?" Rilke responds, well, the first thing he says is, and I quote, "Ahem. I don't know. It probably sucks, since you are 19, right?" I might be paraphrasing a little, but he does give some constructive criticism. He even recommends a couple of books for, well, I suppose at this point it's for you, the reader, to read. And I hear you, what the is this Inception shit? There's a list within a list now. I do think Niels Line by Jens Peter Jacobsen is actually pretty good. Jacobsen being recommended by Rainer Maria Rilke makes a lot of sense contextually too. Give it a go if you are in a German literature mood. I think the idea here is that you do have to at least be aware of what works. If you are writing fantasy, for example, you have to have gone through the Fellowship of the Ring at least once. Basically. The overarching argument in this book comes down to why do we write? Which is interesting, right? Would you die if you stopped? Probably not literally. If it's just your creative outlet, there's no reason to think about it too much, but if you're looking to make a career out of it, it might do you good to start thinking about your own reasoning. Similar to people who are into, say, bodybuilding. They aren't necessarily trying to enter a bodybuilding competition, but we are only human. The things that we do become more meaningful once meaning is expressed. Even if you aren't making money from it, creativity in writing is, according to Rilke at least, introspect. There's a Penguin Books translation that came out in 2011. It includes footnotes, a chronology, and even the letter from a young worker, which is a whole different thing, but complements the reading nicely. Read it in German, if you can though. Number 9 is Writing Tools, 50 Essential Strategies for Every Writer by Roy Peter Clark. A comprehensive guide on how to get better at writing? This seems like it was made for this list, doesn't it? Then why is it so low? Basically, early on it gives you very matter-of-fact advice that you can immediately apply and see improvement. Things like mind the way you order your sentences, use active voice, and don't overdo it with the adverbs. That's all well and good, Honestly, the whole active boys thing is probably the best advice you can give to a young writer, and the book has the best explanation of how it works I've ever come across. If a subject performs an action, it's an active verb. If it's performed to them, it's passive. Otherwise, it's a linking verb, a form of the verb to be. So the chef cooks a meal is active, while the meal is cooked by the chef is passive. Simple enough. But this will instantly improve your writing, make it a bit more evocative, a bit more exciting, a bit more fun, like sexually. No, but maybe? No. The issue here is that the advice becomes more esoteric the further we go along. We come across stuff like character archetypes and finding your boys, which this is a still useful advice, but there's other books that explain these things in more detail. For example, The Hero of a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell is mentioned. Frankly, I think the argument Campbell makes is at best reductive and at worst shallow and pedantic. But if you are trying to understand what an archetype is, that is what you want to read. Even the more tangible things here can be found elsewhere. Roy Peter Clark mentions LaMotte, Strong and White a couple of times. They are in this list in spite of touching some of the same themes this book does, because I think depth is important. Nevertheless, this is pretty good if you're trying to cover your bases, and it even guides you towards more resources. Plus, I do quite like the advice dealing with discipline and organization, in particular because this is the book that introduced me to the concept of an engine, as in a guiding question for your writing. Again, I had to look elsewhere for proper deliberation, which is how I arrived on Rainer Maria Rilke in the first place, but this book did give me the tools to get there. Number 8 is The Tough Guide to Fantasyland by Diana Wynne Jones. This book is, at the end of the day, just Diana Wynne Jones poking fun at some fantasy tropes she noticed as a fan of the genre. But the framework here is you are taking a tour through Fantasyland, which is the world in which every fantasy story ever takes place. The book is telling you what to expect and how things usually work, which ends up making this very useful if you get stuck. Let me explain. Say that you are thinking about how magic should work in your book. Go to M for magic. There you go. A fairly simple explanation of how a magic system traditionally works, and even some ideas to kickstart the process of making yours. Obviously, you don't want your story to just be a bunch of tropes stitched together, and even if you do, I'm speaking to the people who don't exclusively write movie scripts with Dwayne Johnson in mind. I don't mean to be rude, but we can't all be George Preston Tucker, so go back to your, admittedly, pretty sweet gig and let me do my thing. There is a lot of gold to be found here, which goes to show, even when DWJ is just, as the British say, pissing, she can't help but be insightful. Again, for example, she jokingly says that in Fantasyland, the ecology is usually messed up because of some ancient wizard war, so there are very few wild animals. This also has to do with the fact that we might not be particularly interested in actual ecology in our fantasy world. But what if we were? It comes down to that, really. What you get here is a very successful author dissecting an entire genre. Then it's up to you what to do with that. Number 7 is On Writing by Ernest Hemingway. Whatever success I have had has been through writing what I know about. Ernest Hemingway, 1949. Holy shit, was Hemingway the guy who came up with that? Let me just... No, it wasn't him. It might have been Mark Twain though. Anyways, I like treating this book as if it was a magic 8-ball, so for this reason, this is the one book that I will recommend you buy a physical copy of. You open it up, and let's see what nugget of wisdom we find this time. Remember to get the weather in your goddamn book. Weather is very important. Ernest Hemingway, 1932. What? so it doesn't always work, but I do like to do it from time to time. And if you do want to read it normally, I recommend starting with the more tangible stuff, like you first read about Hemingway's take on character writing and how to make a good title. Don't expect this guy to actually give you any methodology though. 3 things you'll quickly learn here is that 1. Ernest Hemingway probably sucked at poker. 2. He did a lot of his writing by feel. He'll start when he feels like it, he'll stop when he feels it's right. A lot of this, however, comes back to the fact that, well, a writer needs to cultivate a rich inner life to create something worthwhile. And Hemingway had a pretty rich inner and outer life, didn't he? The 3rd thing you'll learn is that for all of his macho bravado, Ernest Hemingway was a sensitive guy. Us getting any useful advice boils down to whether Hemingway was in the correct headspace to talk about the metacontextual aspect of his work at any given time. A bunch of his quotes, you can kind of imagine him smoking a cigar as thick as a pork and then drinking some foul Caribbean concoction before grumbling on about how a book is like a woman and also like gambling. Those don't really help us. But the ones in between are transcendental. Developing and cultivating this sensibility is something that happens with time and discipline, as far as I can tell. No shortcuts. Number 6 is Dangerous Men and Adventurous Women, romance writers on the appeal of romance, as edited by Jen Ann Kranz. Listen. If I learned anything from The Princess Bride, is that all great stories have an element of romance to them. It doesn't mean that they end with a kiss necessarily, but romance is universal. And this, my friends, this is the romance book. More like a collection of essays and reminiscences by various authors. They touch on romance as a genre, the nature of the romantic story as understood during its heyday, and I really lost you, huh? Yeah, it's about Harlequin books. No, not that one. Not those either. I'm talking about the trashy stuff from the 80s and 90s that used to dominate the market so hard they might be directly responsible for the weird marketing trend where every book had Fabio on the cover at some point. Yeah, they started that. In this kind of romance book, there's rarely a tyrannical government to topple or dragon to slay. The main antagonist is, funnily enough, also the love interest, and the heroine, well, her main goal is to tame this man into domesticity. I found this book particularly useful when looking to integrate the romantic elements into a different genre. It's not really about prose or Dangerous Men and Adventurous Women gives us across a couple of different essays, plenty of tools that I haven't been able to find elsewhere, because those trashy romance novels did something in particular that is seldom seen. They were all about reader identification. It goes in depth into the way, well, especially women, read. You see, there's this emphasis on courtship and how using the romantic hero's POV is a way to help the reader understand the romantic heroine. I get that we could just ignore this kind of stuff and write a book for the fellas, but I found that a lot of the themes and elements discussed here often come up in sci-fi and fantasy stories, because again, romance doesn't have to be about carnal desire, and also I'll take anything that helps me become a little bit better. Number 5 is Wonder Book, the illustrated guide to creating imaginative fiction by Jeff Vandermeer and Jeremy Serfus. A book designed to take you by the hand as you discover your own creative voice. By its nature, a lot of the early stuff can be a bit hard to grasp. Good news is, there's enough variance in the examples given and activities proposed to avoid getting into the sort of laissez-faire situation that plagues these kinds of books. I'm of course talking about the issue of getting an idea on what to write in the first place, and how to keep the creative juices flowing. Wonder Book's early chapters are great for that. It even has multimedia elements where it will occasionally direct you Rudy Poo candy towards some colorful assignments in the Wonder Book webpage. Assuming that as of right now it is still up, let's see. It is. This is essentially a creative writing workshop in book form. The middle part of the book is, of course, full of essays and advice about story structure from successful writers, from writing the very first line and the importance of having a good hook to the construction of a fight scene, and even proper pacing, such as closing a scene at a point of high tension, as in the fact that is more engaging than letting it drag. This might seem obvious, but since there's actual specific examples and exercises to help you practice, I figured it was worth mentioning. But then, oh baby, then we get into the good shit. I know for a fact that all the sci-fi heads and weird fiction aficionados out there pop off when they hear the name Ban Der Meer. We have all been thinking it, right? Annihilation. You know for a fact that there's two things that this dude knows, and that's character writing and world building. It even has the weird Michael Sisko looping circuits instead of the stupid Joseph Campbell hero's journey. Honestly, this book is worth it for that alone. Number 4 is The Elements of Style by William Strunk Jr. and E.V. White. Ah yes, the book that treats writing as if it was math. I say this in the best way possible, by the way. This stuff is pragmatic, you know, actually functional. It tells you how to use a semicolon, for crying out loud. There's books that specifically quote from this book, and then on top of that try to add a bit of a context to make the information useful for creative writing. Some of them in this very list, well, here I say, f**k that, man. Teach me how to properly group words into sentences. Obviously, this isn't everyone's cup of tea. I do like keeping a copy of the 2011 print on hand though. It's all down to utility. You wanna know if you are writing in active voice? Look for it in chapter 11. There's examples on everything. Is your phrasing looking a bit wonky? Chapter 13 to check if you can cut down a couple of words here and there. Style is such a weird term, isn't it? My understanding is that, in writing at least, it deals with form. Grammar has a bit to do with it, but you can in fact have good grammar and have a sloppy or inefficient style. It's kind of how you can have a lot of money and be in good shape, but still have no bits. So get it twisted. This is financial advice. This book will give you money and reason. Number 3 is Bird by Anne Lamott. And the award for the best breakdown of the actual physical act of writing goes to, I swear to God, Anne Lamott, she gets me, man. On the risk of sounding really stupid, anyone else didn't figure out her dad is the guy who wrote Anti-California until she quotes directly from the book. Is Anti-California still mandatory reading in college? Was it ever mandatory reading anywhere outside of California? Anyway, enough about me. Let's talk birds. It really comes down to a fact that the only way to do something as big as a novel is bit by bit. A lot of the book deals with these problems. Listen to your own intuition, surround yourself with interesting things, join a writer's circle. Perfectionism is actually a bad quality to have unless you are a scientist. I have also found that drafting and having other people read your drafts will in fact improve the quality of your work fairly quickly. The trick is, you have to be friends with people of different walks of life, so that they have different opinions and insights. Turns out a big part of being a writer is learning to listen to constructive criticism. The real treasure here though is on the base. It's the answer to, well, why though? Why write? This book has no esoteric insight on this. It has one chapter centered on the question. But in all honesty though, Anne Lamott wrote an entire book on why she writes, and why you should too. It's this one, by the way, in case that wasn't clear. It helps answer the question that you will encounter eventually, and that you must answer. Why? Well, real G's are honest about their ambitions and expectations. Number 2 is A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, in which 4 Russians give a masterclass in writing, reading, and life by George Saunders. Have you ever felt privileged to be able to do something? this book does it for me. One of my all-time faves talking early 20th century Russian literature, and I get to read it. It's no secret, I'll say it proudly even. I'm kind of a George Saunders stan. I like experimental stuff, GS does it well. Of course, I would like to be where the people are, to quote a certain Small Mermaid, but this is pretty close, and I'm happy to be pretty close. So, what's the goal? Please note, I'm not asking for a third time why you specifically are writing right now. I'm trying to give the act itself a purpose, because the book has a great argument for that. We write a sentence so that the reader will want to read the next one. You can extrapolate this to paragraphs, pages, or whole novels, and the way we do this is by finding a way to make the reader feel something. By us moving them, they move forward, and the reader can be you, as in you can write for yourself. This book does touch on structure and style, but because of the constraints placed upon it by its nature, like every other college class, you aren't meant to learn any useful skills here. It's a lecture. You are meant to learn big words, be shallow and pedantic. The real appeal of this book, in my eyes at least, is that it is both a Russian literature anthology and a research for your own writing journey. And you know me, I love me a good old short story collection. A couple of the stories here are straight up best available translation as of the time of publication, in my humble opinion at least. A good translation is something you can expect, but honestly, aren't entitled to. You should be thankful is what I'm preaching here. This is very well curated. Number 1 is On Writing a Memoir of the Craft. King! So I'll lay it down right now. I'll joke around about Stephen King being meandering and his books being junk food, but I have a hell of a lot of respect for the guy, and a lot of it comes from this book. The first 98 pages constitute a short biography, a memoir if you will, from very early memories through his success, his struggles with addiction, but most importantly, his views on writing and his work ethic. You can only give what you have after all, so I feel like this context is extremely important. Same goes for the previously mentioned Bird by Anne Lamott, but big difference is that I actually enjoy reading fiction, and Stephen King is a fiction guy. Not that Anne Lamott doesn't do it, but yeah, Blue Shoe fucking sucks. 11/22/63 is awesome. That's all there is really. Now let's get down to brass tacks. A large portion of this book is basically just Stephen King takes you through the elements of a style by Strunk and White. So, I hear you ask, why is that book on 4th and this on 1st? Simple. A good teaser makes a big difference. It's not the carpentry metaphors or the funny excerpts from other books that makes this one either, although they do help. Mr. King is very much a practical kind of guy. He has some good advice. I'm not saying that writing 10 pages a day is easy, but it does seem achievable if you are consistent. It's only 2,000 words. If Stephen King struggles with it, it means it's probably fine for me to have a difficult time too. It's basically what it comes down to. But also the guy speaks from experience, right? I mean, the process for an aspiring writer to get published is probably a bit different nowadays. Our favorite writing boomer is still out here talking about magazines and newspapers, but the spirit still remains. Get out there, make noise, have fun, never give up. Do what makes you happy. With that, we are done. Like, share, and subscribe for more lists. Tell me about a book that has helped you with your own writing in the comments, or maybe if there's one you'd like me to break down in a bit more detail. Tune in on a couple of weeks to check up on how my own project is going. That's right, I'm taking my own advice and writing a fantasy novel, and I'll be documenting my progress right here. That being said, have a wonderful rest of your day.